I would like to take a moment to officially recognize our distinguished panelists and moderators that are with us today. And although they've already been introduced, I would like to thank our morning panel. I think, as some of you know, Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday is barely a year away. And here at the Reagan Foundation, a number of events are underway to commemorate that important occasion. But I think if you add it up, you would see that the amount of time that the members of that first panel spent serving in top positions with Ronald Reagan would exceed 100 years. So thank you all for joining us. And on that panel, first to recognize former Attorney General and Counsel to Ronald Reagan, Ed Meese. Next, his National Security Advisor, Richard Allen. Rick. Former Secretary of the Navy, and I think I should mention this because being here in California near Hollywood, the famous movie Top Gun would not have been made if it were not for the support of Secretary John Lehman. John Lehman. The former White House speechwriter, who, as we know, worked on the important speech in Berlin, Peter Robertson. Peter? There it is. And as moderator, John McCaslin, who is co-host of America's Morning News, which is heard across the country here on KFWB, also columnist for the Inside the Beltway column. Thank you, John. John McCaslin. And now I'd like to recognize those who will be serving on our afternoon panels. First, we are honored to have with us President of the Czech Republic, the Honorable Václav Klaus. Former Deputy Prime Minister of Poland, Leszek Balcerowicz. Former Prime Minister of Estonia, Mart Laar. Timuri Yasbashvili, State Minister for Reintegration for Georgia. From London, Lord Charles Pole, former advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And Steve Forbes will be this afternoon. He has not arrived yet, but he too will be on the panel, which will be moderated by Edward Lucas of The Economist. And then our final panel for the afternoon will include John O'Sullivan, Executive Editor of Radio Free Europe. And from Harvard University, Richard Pipes. We have three distinguished scholars from the Heritage Foundation that will be on the panel. Peter Brooks, Lee Edwards, and Robin Harris. And moderating the panel will be Matt Kaminsky from the Wall Street Journal. Now, I'd like to just take a moment to thank the Heritage Foundation for partnering with us on today's conference. Their commitment to building an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish is just what President Reagan wanted for our country. And representing the Heritage Foundation today, among others, is their president, Ed Fulner. Ed, thank you for joining us and for all you've done to make this conference a success. And of course, the woman who was at President Reagan's side for over 50 years, who so wonderfully served as his First Lady and our First Lady, Nancy Reagan. Well, I can say with confidence that our speaker today ranks among America's greatest secretaries of state. As a principal player on President Reagan's team in ending the Cold War, he helped realize what the ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu called the best kind of victory, that which is won without fighting. Achieving a peaceful and successful conclusion to the 50-year struggle between East and West was among history's most dazzling examples of strategic and diplomatic brilliance. President Reagan would want us to remember that this was a success not only for the United States and the West, it was a success for the long-oppressed people of Russia, Eastern Europe, the Baltics, the many nationalities of the Soviet Empire, and yes, the entire world. And among the primary architects of that success was Secretary of State George Shultz. Because of his tremendous impact in that position, many people forget that Secretary of State was the second job George Shultz had in President Reagan's administration. From the beginning of the administration until he became Secretary of State in July 1982, he served as chairman of President's Economic Policy Advisory Board. And in that capacity, he played a principal role in another historic Reagan-era achievement, the President's Economic Recovery Program. That economic program inaugurated nearly a quarter century of vigorous and sustained economic growth. And it's important to remember that the economic and strategic triumphs of the Reagan administration were closely related. Putting economic stress on the Soviet system, leading it, in President Reagan's words, to implode, was central to the President's thinking. The first step in this strategy was reinvigorating our own economy. The second step was pressuring the Soviet economy and persuading Moscow that there was a better way. And as the Soviet Union began to crack and crumble, George Shultz helped President Reagan make clear to the Soviets that America did not pose a military threat, that we were ready to be friends with them and helping them to become a normal nation. It was diplomacy at its most proud, most profound, and most delicate. Please join me in welcoming Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, George P. Shultz.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Nancy, Mr. President, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all fellow admirers of Ronald Reagan. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So spoke President Ronald Reagan on June 12, 1987. In the background was the Brandenburg Gate, all too visible behind the wall. Reagan's stirring words, though noted at the time, came dramatically alive when the wall was literally and joyously torn down some 20 years ago. Didn't do right by these pages. Here we are at the library of the man who spoke those stirring and prophetic words. We must ask ourselves, why did the wall come down? And what can we learn from this historic event? These questions are important because the disappearance of the wall is a metaphor for the end of the Cold War, which occurred largely without bloodshed. And the lessons we should learn are potentially useful because security concerns once again threaten the freedom and prosperity of our world. I will speak particularly about the Reagan years, since they were an important part of the picture because I know them from personal experience. But I recognize one of the most important reasons for success. We in the West had a strategy that we were able to sustain for almost half a century. The basic architecture was put in place and solidified in the Truman and Eisenhower years. And that architecture, particularly the NATO alliance, served us well throughout the Cold War. Let me first talk about a few ideas that underlie our success. The strategy of containment was central. The West undertook to resist any expansion of the Soviet Empire with the expectation that, sooner or later, the internal contradictions in the empire would cause it to look inward, and in the end, to change. As this went on, the guiding idea shifted. The new idea was détente. We're here, you're there, that's life. So the name of the game is peaceful coexistence. Well, that's a lot better than war, especially nuclear war. But as has been noted, Ronald Reagan preferred the initial idea. He denounced détente and stood by his belief that the Soviet Union would change, because he said in his Tear Down That Wall speech, "In the West today, we seek a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity. We see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in human history." In the communist world, we see failure, technological backwardness, declining standards of health, even want of the most basic kind, too little food. He made some people, not me, nervous with his views and his rhetoric. But the idea that change is possible turned out to be an energizing and motivating stimulant, true to the original concept of containment. Let me tell you a story about those words and how some people were uneasy. Do you remember when he made a speech in which he said, "The Soviet Union is an evil empire"? All hell broke loose. There were wild denunciations. And one of my colleagues at the State Department, a wonderful man, Paul Nitze, who'd served a long time, was testifying before a Senate committee. And they were denouncing this statement. And finally, one of them at the end said, "Paul, how can you serve in an administration where the president would call the Soviet Union an evil empire?" And there was sort of a pause. And Paul said, "Senator, have you considered the possibility that the statement might be accurate?" Of course, there was a lot of inspiration in this. And as we have learned, people behind the Iron Curtain took heart. They said, somebody gets it. So that gives encouragement. And you could see it when you met with them. Whenever I would go to Moscow, I would always meet with dissidents. Sometimes, always, the Soviet leadership didn't like it much, but anyway, this is what I did, and this is what Ronald Reagan wanted me to do, instructed me to do. I remember particularly on one occasion, we had set up in the American ambassador's residence a Seder, and people knew about it, and I was given little things to take, picture of a granddaughter this man is unlikely ever to see, and so on. So you go to a meeting like that and you feel that your job is to kind of buck them up because here they are being oppressed. And you're hardly there, then you realize it's the other way around. They are so inspiring. And you see, here are these individual human beings, and this all-powerful state cannot suppress them. They believe what they believe. That's it. So you go back home and tell President Reagan that story, and it only confirms all of his beliefs. A second idea, the concept of linkage, characterized the pre-Reagan approach to our relationship with the Soviet Union. The Reagan administration inherited the result of the application of this idea. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, President Carter was surprised, distressed, and angered. In reaction, he shut down everything from participation by U.S. athletes in the Moscow Olympics to negotiations on arms control and even the annual visit of Foreign Minister Gromyko to Washington prior to the opening of the UN General Assembly. As I took office, my friend, West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, counseled me. He said, "George, the situation is dangerous. There is no human contact." To put it another way, linkage had been vastly overdone. President Reagan understood that linkage could work against the right outcome. Linkage could encourage the Soviets to do something bad just so they could agree to give it up in order to get something else they wanted. And if the Soviets did something good, linkage put pressure on us to go along with something else they were doing wrong. Above all, Ronald Reagan was determined to pursue freedom and make an effort to reduce nuclear armaments no matter what else was going on. We've confronted this issue most dramatically in September 1983, when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner. The Boeing 747, with its unique profile, was carrying 269 passengers and crew. We obtained and released, I might say, there was quite a little battle between Ronald Reagan and the Central Intelligence Agency, but being president, he prevailed. You could understand why they didn't want to release it, but anyway, they finally did. So we had released a recording of the fighter pilot with his ground controller, who, after enough time to consult with upper echelons of his government, authorized him to fire. Of course, we and the rest of the world were outraged. But rather than cut ties, as his predecessor had done, and over the objections, I might say, of a great many members of his administration, President Reagan authorized me to go ahead with an earlier scheduled meeting with Foreign Minister Gromyko. Talk at the meeting was harsh and blunt. And at one point, Gromyko got mad and started to leave. He picked up his papers, and I basically said, "Go ahead." And he sat back down again. Our longtime interpreter told me that it was the most difficult and tumultuous meeting he had ever observed. I thought it was good for Gromyko, and I reported to President Reagan. He thought it was good for Gromyko to hear directly and emphatically how appalled we were, as were people throughout the world. Even more important, and once again over many objections, President Reagan sent our arms control negotiators back to Geneva to continue their quest for an agreement. So it is not evidence of weakness that you meet with your counterpart. The important point is, what do you say? We in the West also understood the importance of strength in its many dimensions. Free societies and free economies, with some help from the Marshall Plan, produced prosperity. These successes, in turn, produced confidence. The achievements could be made known through organizations such as Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, along with the British Broadcast Corp, BBC, and Voice of America. So strength has many dimensions, including, of course, military capability. NATO was formed and held together. There were many difficult moments. Who can forget the Berlin airlift and the resolute Berliners, as we in the NATO countries stood with them? Now, Ronald Reagan believed in strength, we had three watchwords: reality, see the world as it is, don't kid yourself, be strong, and use diplomacy. So the strength, I think, was evident in many ways, not just the military buildup and the economic performance. But it always seemed to me, traveling around as Secretary of State and listening to counterparts, that when he faced down the air controllers, it made a huge impact. Because every country has that problem. And in many ways, the air controllers have you by the throat. So here is this guy over in America, and he takes them on. Well, that's impressive. But even more impressive, he wins. So winning is important. And that made a huge impression about the strength of the man and also about his word. When he says something, he means it. I believe the vital turning point in the Cold War was the deployment of Pershing missiles in Germany in late 1983. That deployment did not come easily, even though it was the implementation of a long-known NATO agreement. The run-up to the deployment, and first there was a deployment in Britain, and we weren't worried about that. Margaret Thatcher could see that through despite protests. Deployment in Italy, which they saw through well, but Germany was the big apple because the missiles being deployed there were ballistic missiles. And we knew the Soviets would be really allergic to something from German soil that presumably could hit Moscow. So the run-up to this deployment was accompanied by a drumbeat of threats from the Soviet Union. War, they implied, was in the offing, and the threats from the Soviet Union had an effect on the West. In 1983, the nuclear freeze movement in New York City's Central Park still stands as one of the largest public demonstrations in American history. When massive and repeated demonstrations took place throughout the United Kingdom, protesters filled the streets. Some politicians went wobbly. Ronald Reagan stood firm. And in the end, a coherent NATO was on display. The heroes of this turning point were Ronald Reagan, who maintained a highly credible diplomatic effort, and without that, he couldn't have succeeded, combined with strong resolve, and former Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Kohl. For despite the opposition to the 1983 deployment that manifested itself in the United States and the United Kingdom, no one in the West came under pressure as intense as that faced by the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. No one. If that deployment had not gone forward, our strength and our willpower could have been shattered, and the outcome of the Cold War might well have been different. After we had both left office, President Gorbachev visited me at Stanford, and we were sitting in my backyard, just the two of us with his interpreter. And I said to him, when you and I took office, the Cold War was about as cold as it could get. And when you left and Ronald Reagan left, it was all over but the shouting. What do you think was the turning point? And he said without a moment's hesitation, Reykjavik. I said, why do you say that? He said, well, for 2 days, the two leaders sat and talked with each other about everything important there was, and we really communicated, and we really saw that we could get somewhere. And then he said, well, what do you think was the turning point? I said, I thought Reykjavik was important, but I thought the turning point was when we deployed missiles in Germany at the end of 1983. That show of NATO cohesion and of strength in the face of all the propaganda you threw at us was the turning point. Once that was accomplished, gradually things began to shift. So that show of strength was terrific. But now I note that the strength we put on display was never used. What preceded the deployment was Ronald Reagan's intense diplomacy with the Soviet Union and a continuing and even more intense consultative process among the Allies. In the end, that process made the deployment possible, and the deployment, a magnificent display of strength and determination and cohesion of NATO, in turn, made possible the diplomacy that followed, and in the end tore down the wall. And by containing the Soviets, by making it clear that we would not permit them to isolate Berlin or to block NATO deployments of nuclear-armed ballistic missiles on German soil, NATO established the conditions in which brave people throughout the Warsaw Pact could bring the Cold War to a peaceful end. President Reagan called on Mr. Gorbachev to tear down that wall. In the end, it was the German people who did so. There's a story about Honecker. You remember Honecker? He was the last communist ruler in East Berlin. And the story is he had a new girlfriend, and she was a beauty. Curvaceous, interesting, fun. She had it all. And he was crazy about it. He said, "I'll do anything for you, absolutely anything." And she said, "Really? Anything? Yeah, anything you ask." He says, "Well, how about tearing down the Berlin Wall?" And he thought about it for a minute. He said, "Aha, I see you want to be alone with me." So we see on display here a set of important ideas. Change toward freedom and openness is possible. Economic development goes in tandem with political openness. Strength of purpose and capability are essential. Strength works in tandem with diplomacy. They're not alternatives, they work in tandem. A deep and continuing consultative process among like-minded people creates the understanding necessary to make hard choices. A successful strategy must be based on realism and sustainability. Well, the Cold War is over. The world now proceeds on a global basis, and economic expansion, despite the current setback, has taken place almost everywhere and in many developing countries at an unprecedented pace. But we know all too well what constitutes the main threat to the continuation of economic progress and political openness that tends to be its handmaiden. The threat posed by Islamic extremists using the weapon of terror, even potentially nuclear terror, is all too real. We have seen the face of terror in the Americas, in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, in every corner of the world. There are Islamists who would build a kind of wall of ideology in an effort to shut in vast multitudes of believers in Islam who nevertheless wish for a better life consistent with the teachings of their religion. These radical jihadists promulgate a culture of hate and division. What lessons can we draw from our earlier experiences as we combat and seek to isolate the forces of division and find accommodation with more moderate and tolerant Islam? The notion of containment can also work against terrorism, as it did against the Soviet Union. If we can prevent the spread of hateful ideology, then we have taken the first essential step. If you look at Indonesia and Malaysia, countries with large numbers of Muslims, you will see some signs that their strategy of containment can work. And remember that the strategy of containment includes the idea that change is possible. So look at Algeria today, where, as reported by the New York Times, 60% of the enrollment in colleges is by women, and they are filling an increasing array of jobs, including 70% of Algeria's lawyers and 60% of its judges. I'm told women are even driving taxi cabs in Algiers. That's not supposed to be in the creed. Economic development based on human effort, not just the exploitation of oil wealth, can lead to more open political systems Why not encourage that kind of development in Islamic lands and communities? Strength is always a key. The military capability, the willpower, and the self-confidence to act when necessary. A special challenge is created by the potentially devastating consequences of a terrorist attack. Huge numbers of lives lost, in addition to destruction of property and economic damage and dislocation. The need for sharply improved intelligence capability is obvious. Knowledge about attacks before they take place is essential. Then we have an uncomfortable decision to make, especially when the culprit group or individuals are in a country where terrorists are tolerated or even assisted. Faulty intelligence can get us into big trouble. But the failure to use preventive force when capability and intent are clear can have consequences that are simply not acceptable. Now, in the Reagan period, we used force, active force, only 3 times. The first time was Grenada. And we had a large number, 350 so Americans there. And a murderous regime had taken control of Grenada from a democratic elected regime, all Cubans, sponsored by the Soviet Union. And you could just see a hostage crisis coming. So what's better, to wait, consult with everybody forever, let the hostages be taken, and then after the fact decide what to do? I don't think so. I think Ronald Reagan was right. He acted before that happened. He took preventive force. We were in there, we got our hostages out. I remember I was the designated person on the day of the beginning of the action when it became public to go to the Congress. I spent all day long, and there was hardly a good word said. And our C. Charles Powell sitting here, our friend Margaret Thatcher was denouncing us all over the place. And I had been somewhere on Tuesday, Wednesday, I came back, and Howard Baker, who was our leader in the Senate, called me up and he said, "George, things have turned around here." I said, "What happened?" Howard, was I so persuasive? He said, "No, they heard from the folks back home." And by that time, the first of the Americans that were rescued had gotten home, and the first guy off the plane kissed the ground. I said to the president, "Mr. President, the fat lady just sang." So that makes a big difference. I might say the other 2 instances where we used active force were when we had incontrovertible evidence that from a building in Libya had come the instructions which led to an attack that killed some of our soldiers in Berlin. We showed that intelligence to Margaret Thatcher, and she was fully in support of what we did. We showed it to Mitterrand, and he wouldn't allow flights over French territory. But at any rate, it was incontrovertible. So we had a very neat operation. I had to take my hat off to our Navy and Air Force people who conducted it and took out that building. And the other time we used force was when, in the Persian Gulf, the Iranians were trying to rough up Kuwaiti shipping. And maybe you remember, after quite a struggle, we reflagged the ships to U.S. flag, and then we could protect them. The president of Iran was at the United Nations giving a speech saying the last thing in the world Iran would do would be put a mine in the Persian Gulf. At that moment of time, one of our Navy ships was taking pictures of them doing it. We then boarded the ship, took some mines for evidence, took off the sailors, sank the ship, took the sailors to Dubai, and told the Iranians, "Come and get your sailors and cut it out." Now, people say we didn't communicate with Iran. I thought we communicated pretty clearly. Ronald Reagan understood communication. I might say our Marines in Lebanon, that tragic day, I'll never forget it, being a Marine particularly, that was the worst day of our administration. They were not there in any active use of force. They were there on a peacekeeping mission. And I think all of us, the President and I, lost a lot of sleep second-guessing ourselves on that one. But the real uses of force were very limited, only 3 times. Here are some other ideas that can be effective. Consultation and diplomatic engagement are essential. To paraphrase Helmut Schmidt, there is no substitute for human contact. The point is to be careful what you say and to be sure your diplomacy is supported by strength. I remember from my Marine Corps boot camp days, you sign up in the Marine Corps, as I did at the start of World War II, and you think you're going to become a Marine. You don't. You become a boot. And only after you have survived boot camp do you become a Marine. And I can remember my drill instructor handing me my rifle. And he says, "Take good care of this rifle. This is your best friend. And remember one thing. Never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. No empty threats." I told that story to President Reagan. He loved that story. And he lived by that idea. And that's one reason when he said something, people took him seriously, because they knew he meant it. All too often, people blithely say something or other is not acceptable. Then it happens and it's accepted. I say, if you say it's unacceptable, be sure you're ready to do something about it. And if you're not ready to do something about it, don't say it in the first place, because you'll lose your... Perhaps we can also gain some momentum from this agenda and strength, cooperation, containment, and diplomacy from the pursuit of 2 big ideas on a global scale. Each one is drawn from Ronald Reagan's playbook. First, can we find a way to a world free of nuclear weapons? I'm working hard on this problem on a nonpartisan basis with Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry, among many others. We take a cue from development that took place in the Reykjavik meeting between President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev some years before the Berlin Wall came down. I can remember that little room in Hofty House. Gorbachev's on one end of the table, President Reagan's on the other. I'm sitting beside him. My opposite number, Shevardnadze's behind Gorbachev, and we sat there for a long time. And we came very close to consummating an agreement like that. It didn't take place because President Reagan, I think absolutely correctly, refused to give up the Strategic Defense Initiative. He was determined to learn how to defend ourselves. But while as we left Reykjavik, immediately we felt a little down, after we got back to Washington with a little reflection, we agreed, and I said to the President, it was a success, not a failure, because once things get out on the table, and at that meeting, the Soviets for the first time agreed that human rights was a legitimate, regular item on our agenda. So that was a big breakthrough. And then they basically agreed on what became the INF Treaty of zero nuclear weapons, and on the START Treaty, which was cut strategic arms in half. Those things were all put on the table. It took a while to reel them in after they were there, but they were there. Many steps toward a world free of nuclear weapons need to be taken, and with great care. At the same time, the world is gradually rallying around this grand endeavor. The use of nuclear weapons has never made sense. Now, as they spread, the likelihood grows that they will be used rather than merely relied on for their deterrent value, with potentially disastrous consequences. I might say one of the people who isn't here today, Marty and Annalise Anderson, have made terrific use of the wonderful material in the archives of the Reagan Library. And they have put together a book, it's called Reagan's Secret War, of his long conviction and work to favor a world free of nuclear weapons. This was very deeply held by him. It goes back before his presidency started. And it's really fascinating to see how deeply he thought about this subject. The second is, can we find a way to a global structure that allows us to attack issues of global warming? The Kyoto Protocol could not work because the concept behind it had no chance of global acceptance. The Montreal Protocol, which we developed during the Reagan period, was the 1987 international agreement to phase out the production of materials that were depleting the ozone layer of the atmosphere. That was worked on very carefully during the Reagan period, and when it was completed, Ronald Reagan called it a magnificent achievement. The protocol has been implemented so widely that former UN Secretary Kofi Annan called it perhaps the single most successful international agreement to date. It worked in part because every state was part of the problem and took part in the solution. In this respect, Ronald Reagan led this, the US led this effort. Ronald Reagan's Montreal Protocol has a lot to teach post-Kyoto. We can put those ideas back to work once again. The pursuit of big ideas on a world scale might well generate just the sense of cohesion that would help like-minded nations face down other problems that threaten our peace and our prosperity. I'm deeply honored and moved by the opportunity to speak here at the Reagan Library on this special anniversary. When we arrived early this morning, someone tried to guide us, and my wife and I said, no, I want to go first out where Ronald Reagan is. So we stood there, looked at the view, which he picked, looked at him, saluted. He was a magnificent leader. And anytime I get a chance to speak about his record, I'm proud to do so. And when somebody says, Mr. President, I don't have to ask what president you're talking about. There's only one Mr. President, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Secretary Shultz. It is always a pleasure and an honor to have you here with us. Ladies and gentlemen, the next panel begins shortly downstairs on the first floor of this pavilion. We ask that you use the stairwell over here behind you, as well as the two elevators located to my right to move downstairs. There are restrooms located on this floor behind the mural to my left, as well as downstairs near the Marine One helicopter. Refreshments are also being served down there, so if you could make your way down there promptly, we could begin the next panel. Thank you.